The winter wind howled across the Montana plains as Sarah Chen stood on the porch of the old ranch house, her small fist raised to knock again. Snow clung to her dark hair and the worn jacket that was clearly too thin for this kind of weather. Her cheeks were red from crying and cold, and her breath came out in shaky clouds as she waited, hoping someone would answer. Inside, Jim Patterson had just settled into his favorite chair with a cup of coffee when he heard the timid knocking. It was unusual to get visitors this late in the evening, especially during a snowstorm. He set down his mug and made his way to the door, wondering who would be out in this weather. When he opened it, he certainly didn't expect to find a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing there alone with tears streaming down her face. "Please, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "They hurt my mama. They said terrible things to her because she's Chinese. They pushed her down and she won't get up. Please help us." Jim felt his heart drop into his stomach. He'd been ranching in this part of Montana for 40 years, had raised his own kids here, and thought he knew his community. But lately, he'd noticed tensions he'd never seen before, ugliness creeping into places that had once felt safe. He'd heard whispers at the feed store, seen unfriendly looks cast at the few Asian families who'd moved to the area in recent years. He'd told himself it was just a few bad apples, that most folks around here were decent. Now, looking at this terrified child, he realized he'd been naive. "Come inside, sweetheart," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Where's your mama? How far from here?" "The old Johnson property," Sarah said, stepping into the warm house but not moving any further, as if she was afraid to waste even a second. "We just moved there last month." Mama was walking home from town, and some men in a truck followed her. They yelled at her, told her to go back to China, said she brought the virus here. Then they pushed her and she fell on the ice. I saw it from the window and ran out, but they drove away laughing. Mama's hurt bad. She can't move her leg and there's blood. Jim's jaw tightened. The Johnson property was about 1.5 miles down the road. In this weather, that was a dangerous distance for a child to travel alone, but she'd done it anyway to help her mother. He grabbed his heavy coat, his first aid kit, and his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance right now," he said, dialing as he pulled on his boots. "Then we're going to get your mama." "What's your name, honey?" "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Chen. My mama is Mei Chen. We moved here because mama got a job at the veterinary clinic in town. She's a vet tech. She's really good with animals." Jim nodded as he spoke to the dispatcher, giving them the address and explaining the situation. The ambulance would take at least 20 minutes to get there from town, maybe longer with the roads as bad as they were. He couldn't wait that long. He finished the call, grabbed some blankets, and led Sarah to his truck. The drive that would normally take 5 minutes seemed to take forever. Sarah sat rigid in the passenger seat, her small hands clenched in her lap. Jim tried to keep her talking, both to keep her calm and to get more information. "Did you see what the men looked like? What kind of truck they were driving?" Sarah nodded, her voice steadier now that help was coming. "It was a big blue truck, old and dirty. There were 3 of them. I couldn't see their faces good, but one had a red baseball cap and a big beard. Another one was wearing a brown jacket with something written on the back." Jim's mind was already racing through the people he knew who drove trucks matching that description. It was a small community, and he had a sinking feeling he might know exactly who was responsible. The thought made him sick. These were people he'd known for years, maybe people he'd done business with, shared a beer with at the local bar. How had it come to this? When they arrived at the Johnson property, Jim's headlights illuminated a small figure lying on the ground near the driveway. Mei Chen was conscious but clearly in pain, her face contorted as she tried to sit up. Sarah jumped out of the truck before it had fully stopped and ran to her mother, kneeling beside her. "Mama, I brought help. This man is going to help us." Jim approached carefully, kneeling on the other side of Mei. "Ma'am, I'm Jim Patterson. The ambulance is on its way. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Mei's English was accented but clear. "My leg, I think it's broken. And my head, it when he fell. Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping us." Her voice cracked on the last words, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm sorry to be trouble. I just want to live here peacefully with my daughter. I just want to work and make a good life. You're not the trouble here, ma'am, Jim said firmly. The people who did this are the trouble. Let me get some blankets on you to keep you warm until the ambulance arrives. Try not to move that leg. As he carefully tucked blankets around May, making sure not to jostle her injured leg, he noticed the fear in her eyes wasn't just from pain. It was the fear of someone who no longer felt safe in the place she'd chosen to call home. Her hands were scraped and bleeding from where she tried to catch herself when she fell, and there was a nasty bruise forming on her temple. Jim felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. Sarah held her mother's hand, speaking to her softly in what Jim assumed was Mandarin, her voice soothing despite her own fear. It reminded him of his own daughter at that age, the way kids could be so brave and gentle at the same time. The thought that anyone could terrorize this family made him feel ashamed of his community in a way he'd never felt before. The ambulance finally arrived, its lights cutting through the snow and darkness. The paramedics, Tom and Jessica, were people Jim had known for years. They worked quickly and professionally, assessing May's injuries and carefully loading her onto a stretcher. Jim heard Tom mutter something under his breath about cowards who pick on women, and felt a small measure of relief that not everyone in this town had lost their decency. Sarah, you go with your mama in the ambulance, Jim said. I'll follow in my truck and meet you at the hospital. But May reached out and grasped his hand with surprising strength. Please, she said. Please find out who did this. I need to know if we should leave, if it's safe to stay here. I need to know if this is who everyone here is, or if this was just some bad people. Jim squeezed her hand gently. I promise you, ma'am, I'll find out who did this. And I can tell you right now, this is not who we all are. There are good people in this community who will be as horrified by this as I am. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened here tonight. At the hospital, after making sure May was being cared for and that Sarah had something to eat from the vending machines, Jim made his way to the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez was on duty, and when Jim told him what had happened, the deputy's face hardened with anger. We've had 3 other incidents reported in the last month, Martinez said, pulling up files on his computer. Asian family over in Willow Creek had their mailbox smashed and racial slurs spray-painted on their fence. Vietnamese restaurant in town had their windows broken. And now this. This is escalating, and it needs to stop before someone gets killed. Jim leaned forward. I think I might know who was driving that blue truck. There's only a handful of people around here with trucks matching that description. And I heard some talk at the feed store last week, some ugly talk about foreigners and blame for various problems. At the time, I told myself it was just drunk idiots blowing off steam, but I should have said something then. Martinez nodded. We all should have. But we can start now. Give me those names. And I want to talk to Sarah again when she's ready, get a full description of what she saw. Over the next few days, as May recovered from surgery to repair her broken leg, Jim made it his mission to change the narrative in his community. He started by visiting every ranch and farm within 20 miles, talking to his neighbors about what had happened. Some were shocked and sympathetic. Others made excuses or changed the subject. But Jim was persistent, and his reputation as a straight-shooting, honest man carried weight. He organized a community meeting at the local church, and to his surprise and relief, more than 100 people showed up. He told May's story, and Sarah's story, and he didn't mince words about what it meant for their community. I've lived here my whole life, he said, standing at the front of the church hall, his voice carrying to every corner. I've always been proud to call this place home. But what happened to May Chen and what that little girl had to see, that's not something any of us should be proud of. I don't care what you think about immigration policy or where you think people should or shouldn't come from. What I care about is that a woman who came here to work honestly and raise her daughter got attacked in our community, and a child had to walk through a snowstorm at night to find help because some cowards decided to take their anger out on someone they saw as different. There was silence in the room, and then someone in the back stood up. It was Mary Higgins, who ran the local diner. Jimeserait. Ife met Maichen. She came into my place for coffee a few times. She was always polite, always kind. Her daughter is polite too, helps her mama with the door, says please and thank you. That's the kind of people we should want in our community, not the kind we should be driving away. Others began to speak up, sharing their own encounters with the Chen family or expressing disgust at what had happened. Not everyone was on board. A few people left in the middle of the meeting, muttering about political correctness and how people were too sensitive. But they were the minority, and their departures were noted. The sheriff's investigation led to the arrest of 3 men who matched the description Sarah had provided. The blue truck belonged to Dale Morrison, a man Jim had known casually for years. When the arrests were made, there was a lot of talk in the community, some supportive of the arrests and some claiming it was an overreaction to what they called just some pushing and words. Jim made sure to visit May in the hospital several times as she recovered. Each time, he brought something, sometimes practical things like groceries or books for Sarah, sometimes just his presence and conversation. He told her about his own family, about his daughter who was now a teacher in Seattle, about his late wife who had always believed in welcoming newcomers to the community. "I won't lie to you," he said during one visit, sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed while Sarah colored pictures at a small table nearby. "There are some people here who aren't going to welcome you with open arms. But there are more people who are decent, who were as horrified by what happened as I was. And those of us who are decent need to do better at speaking up and showing people like you that you belong here." May smiled, though her eyes were still sad. "I want to believe that. I want Sarah to grow up in a place where she feels safe and welcome. But I'm afraid. What if those men come back? What if there are others like them?" Jim didn't have easy answers. He couldn't promise that nothing bad would ever happen again. But he could promise to do his part to make things better. And over the following weeks and months, he did just that. He organized a welcome committee for new residents. He spoke at the schools about respecting diversity. He made sure that when the trial for May's attackers came up, the courtroom was filled with community members showing support for the Chen family. The 3 men were eventually convicted of assault and hate crimes. The sentences were tough, and the judge made it clear that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. It sent a message to the community, though Jim knew that changing hearts and minds would take more than just one trial. Sarah went back to school, and though there were some difficult days, she also made friends. May returned to work at the veterinary clinic, and over time, became a respected and valued member of the community. Jim often saw them around town, and he always made a point to stop and chat, to check in and make sure they were doing okay. Years later, when Jim was honored by the local historical society for his decades of community service, May and Sarah were in the audience. After the ceremony, Sarah, now a teenager with dreams of becoming a veterinarian like her mother, came up to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for answering the door that night. Thank you for helping us when we needed it most. You showed me that even in the darkest times, there are good people who will stand up and do what's right." Jim hugged her, feeling his own eyes get misty. "You were brave that night, Sarah. Braver than most adults would have been. You saved your mama's life by going for help. Don't ever forget it." Looking back on that snowy night, Jim often thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If he hadn't answered the door. If he'd decided it wasn't his problem. If he'd stayed silent afterward instead of speaking up. But he had answered, and he had helped, and he had spoken up. And in doing so, he'd helped change the trajectory not just for one family, but for an entire community learning to be better than its worst impulses.